Hi guys, this is Dr. Momsilovich with your lecture 12.2 on community ecology. When we're discussing community ecology, remember that we're talking about the interactions between all of the living organisms within an area. So these interactions can be beneficial or harmful to each species or to each individual depending on the type of interaction. And those interactions are what we're going to be focusing on in this lecture. So just as a refresher, a community is a group of populations of two or more different species occupying the same geographical area and in a particular time. So in this case, we have an elephant, some zebras, some springboks, there's grass and trees, there's microbes living in the water and in the soil. There's all kinds of different things. There's insects. There's all of these different things that come into the community and that make up parts of that community. And so a community ecologist won't look at this and just see an elephant and some zebras and some other things. They look at this and think, how are these different individuals and these different species affecting one another, and what sorts of interactions do they have among them? Within community ecology, we look at species interactions and we categorize them according to the effect that each species has on the other. So the effects that different organisms can have on each other can occur at different levels of biological organization. So you can have individuals affecting each other. So you could have maybe somehow the elephant is affecting a zebra and it's affecting that individual's fitness. This can occur at the population level where maybe the springboks are affecting the abundance of the population of zebras because they're competing for the same resources. You can have birth and death rates be affected if there's competition or predation, parasitism, things like that. And some of these things can also affect the carrying capacity. So if you have other organisms competing for grasses and leaves and things like that, it can affect the carrying capacity of other organisms. In the interactions between different species, we can categorize them as either being beneficial or positive, having no effect or a zero effect, and harming or a negative effect. And so if we're looking at the interactions between two species, so in this case it would be species A and species B, if both species are benefiting, we would call that a mutualism. If one species benefits and the other one is unaffected, that would be a commensalism. If one species benefits and the other one is harmed, that would be predation or parasitism. If there's an interaction between two species and neither one is affected in any way, it would be a neutral interaction or a neutralism. And if there is an interaction where one of the individuals is harmed and the other one is not affected at all, that would be an amensalism. The type of interaction where both species or individuals is harmed would be competition. So we're going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail and sort of what falls into each category. So the first is predation, herbivory, and parasitism. So these are interactions where one individual or one species benefits, so it's a positive interaction for one of them, and the other one has a negative experience with this interaction, so they're being harmed in some way. So predators catch prey and consume them, herbivores eat plant material, and parasites live in or on a host and they consume different parts of that host. So in the case of a lion eating its prey, so if it's eating an antelope or a zebra or whatever it's eating, that lion is benefiting because it's getting food and nutrients and it's going to be able to survive another day and live on and possibly reproduce. The prey item is obviously having a negative part of this interaction because it has been killed and it now is no longer going to be able to have any fitness. It's no longer alive, and so it is the negative part of this interaction. a giraffe eating a plant, or any herbivore eating a plant, will have a different amount of an effect depending on how much of the plant that herbivore is eating. So in this case, the giraffe is benefiting because it's consuming nutrients and food that are going to help it survive. The plant is having a negative part of this interaction because it's losing parts of the plant that it had to put energy into, and it's losing leaves and things that are doing photosynthesis and creating food for that plant. So if the giraffe eats just a few leaves and walks away, that's not going to be as harmful of an interaction as if that giraffe were to eat a lot of that plant or eat all of the leaves off of it. That would be very harmful to that plant. So herbivores can affect plants in different ways depending on their level of consumption. Parasites, so like in this example of a human body louse, they will live on a host and eat either parts of them from inside or outside, and they will not necessarily directly impact the survival and reproduction of a host. However, they can have indirect impacts. So it's uncomfortable and it's itchy and whatnot to have lice. And so that can affect your survivorship a little bit. It can affect your ability to reproduce if it's unsightly and others don't want to reproduce with you. So parasites can be detrimental to an organism because they can affect the amount of time and energy that the organism has to put into removing those pests. They can sometimes have other organisms that they other infectious things that can get into the individual's body because of that interaction. And sometimes they can affect the ability of that organism to reproduce. Detritivores are a special type of consumer. So detritivores consume dead organic material or the waste of other species. So they have no direct effect on populations that produce these resources because they're not actively killing anything. They're only consuming the dead material from other living things. So they're not in any way affecting the abundance of their food supplies, and they don't influence the evolution of their resources. They're important for recycling of nutrients within ecosystems, and without them, there would just be dead material building up all over every ecosystem, but they're not in any way affecting the fitness of any individuals, and they're not in any way affecting a carrying capacity or anything like that. So detritivores are consumers, but they're their own special group because they're not actually actively seeking out their food. So if we go back to talking a little bit about predators and their prey each have adaptations to allow them to either capture prey or to evade their predators. So predators vary in size relative to their prey. A predator might be much larger than their prey, so something like a whale that's a lot larger than krill or small fish that they consume. And prey are rarely much larger than their predators. So if you think about it, if you're a predator and you're going out trying to kill something to be able to eat it, it's going to be a lot easier to kill something that is smaller than you or the same size than something that is larger than you. So beyond a certain prey size, a predator can't successfully subdue and consume their prey unless they're cooperative hunters and they are able to take down prey that's substantially larger than them because they hunt in groups. So something like an African wild dog is able to hunt antelope and other large mammals because they hunt in groups, and the group can take down a larger individual than the size of an individual dog. If you think about most things that we think of as predators, so if you think of maybe an owl, or even if you have like a house cat, what they eat is quite a bit smaller than them. So both of them would eat small birds and small rodents because it's much easier to kill something that is smaller than you than something that is larger than you. consumers also have interesting adaptations in their morphology that allows them to eat the type of prey that they are accustomed to. So if you look at the digestive tract of a human and the digestive tract of a rabbit, they look very different. So humans are adapted to eating a variety of things. So they eat meat and berries and plants and grasses and all of these different things. Rabbits are more of a grass eater, so their digestive system is quite a bit longer in comparison to their body size than a human. So their small intestine is very, very long. And that is because it is a lot harder to digest plant material than it is to digest animal protein. So if you eat meat, it's a lot easier for your body to digest that and pull the proteins out of it than if you're something that eats plants. Eating plants is harder on your digestive system. It's harder to pull those nutrients out of plant material than it is to pull it out of protein. And so rabbits have an adaptation where they have this long, small intestine, and then they have an enlarged cecum, and material from their small intestine goes into the cecum and gets packaged, and it's sort of this dense packaged ball that they defecate, and then the rabbit will go back and re-eat that little package of defecated material and redigest it to pull any more nutrients out of it that it didn't already get. And so they have adapted both behaviorally and morphologically to be able to get all of the nutrients out of their food. If you think about something like cows and other ruminants, they have multiple stomachs and they'll actually swallow food after they've chewed it up, let it get a little bit digested. They regurgitate it back into their mouth. It's called their cud. They re-chew it, swallow it back down into another stomach. It gets digested a bit more, and they do that until it is broken down enough that they can actually get the nutrients out of it. So different organisms have different morphological adaptations based on the type of food that they eat. If we look at the type of teeth in something that's a carnivore versus something that's an herbivore, there are big differences and very noticeable differences between those different types of consumers. So something that is a carnivore will have large, sharp teeth that allows that organism to grab onto their prey and pull meat from it. And then they have teeth that are adapted to being able to chew tough, meaty substances. Something that's an herbivore would have flat teeth that allows it to sort of grind back and forth those teeth and grind that plant material down to start breaking it down to allow it to start digesting it. So just by looking at the teeth of an organism, you can tell the type of food that it's adapted to eat. Birds are also something that have adaptations that allow those organisms to eat very specific types of food. So something that eats large nuts and seeds and things like that is going to have a bigger beak that's able to break down those seeds or nuts and get the nutrients that are inside of them out. Other things eat berries and things like that, so they're going to have a smaller, more slender beak. And then things, if you think of like a hummingbird and other birds that eat either nectar from plants or honey out of beehives, they're going to have very long beaks that are able to reach down into those things and suck that nutrient out of there. And so depending on the type of food that an organism eats, it's going to have digestive system as well as mouth parts that are adapted to that type of food. So predators and other consumers have adaptations that allow them to effectively attack and eat their food or their prey item. Things that are usually prey have adaptations to help them avoid being eaten. So there is something called crypsis, which is essentially camouflage, And animals use this to blend in with their backgrounds. And these animals are typically palatable, which means that they're edible. So they wouldn't be harmful if you were to eat them. And so they match their color or their texture to be able to match something and hide from predators. So we have a katydid, which is the small, the green insect on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. So it's going to blend in and look like the leaves that are in its environment. On the right-hand side, you have a peanut bug, which is blending in very well to the bark on this tree, and it's going to make it really, really hard to find them. And so these organisms have become adapted through natural selection to match their environment and to allow them to hide from predators. And so in any other circumstance, either of these would be really noticeable. So if you were to put the katydid on the bark, you would be able to see it really clearly. But as long as they're in their natural native environment, they're going to be very well hidden. And so they also have to have the genetic architecture to be able to adapt a bit if their environment starts to change. So in this case, they're not concealed, but they're mistaken for inedible objects by would-be predators. So they're mistaken for a leaf or bark. And the behaviors of cryptic organisms must correspond to their appearances. So some organisms that have this crypsis will sort of move slowly to make it look like they're blowing in the wind. They'll creep very slowly along the bark to make it less obvious that they're moving. So they've adapted behaviors as well that make them blend in with their environment. So organisms can either blend in to try to hide from their predators, or they can have adaptations that allow them to avoid being eaten that make them unpalatable or not edible. So animals might acquire noxious chemicals from food or manufacture them themselves. So these are organisms that if you were to eat them or come in contact with them, they have chemicals that are poisonous or toxic. And so predators will actually learn to avoid them. So a lot of these animals often have warning coloration, or what we call aposematism. And so they have bright colors or certain color patterns that predators have learned are dangerous and to stay away from them. So these predators learn to avoid the animals after they have an unpleasant experience. So the bombardier beetle actually has chemicals in a few different organs on its backside, and if you come into contact, it will mix those together and it makes essentially like an acidic spray that is very, very harmful. So you want to stay away from that type of organism. There's also something like this caterpillar, which has toxins in its cells that make it so that if you were to eat it, it would make that organism, that predator, very sick, and they would at the very least throw up, if not have something more serious happen to them. So certain aposematic colorations occur so widely that predators may have evolved innate aversions. So a lot of predators naturally know to avoid things that are red, white, and black. In nature, those color patterns usually mean that something is dangerous or that it is toxic and that those organisms want to stay away. So they're born with an innate understanding that those color patterns are dangerous to them. So when we're talking about the way that different possible prey items are able to defend themselves, we all usually are talking about animals, but plants are not completely helpless. So plants, if you know, we're all local to the desert Southwest, so you're familiar with the fact that some plants have spines or prickles on them that keep possible predators away. You don't want to go up and try to eat a cactus because you're going to end up getting poked and you're going to get hurt. Plants also have what we call secondary compounds, and these are produced by plants for purposes, usually defense, other than metabolism. So they're called secondary because they're not compounds that the plant would normally make. They're made as a secondary type of compound in that plant's organ systems that allow it to protect itself from predators. So some of these compounds include things like nicotine or caffeine, cannabinol, atropine, and tannins. And those substances are very harmful to anything that might try to eat them. And so the plants will create those substances, and we call them psychotropic, and we call them that because in a human, if you think about it, if you use nicotine or if you consume caffeine or cannabinol, it's going to have an effect on your nervous system. You're a lot larger than something that's like a small insect or a small mammal, things like that. And so you could hypothetically consume a lot larger quantities of it without having any type of serious effect. If you think about something that's a lot smaller, like a small insect, if it were to eat a lot of a plant that has nicotine or caffeine in it, it could mess with that insect's nervous system enough that it may make it stop eating and move away and go do something else because its nervous system is no longer firing correctly. And so things like caffeine have actually evolved, the same compound has evolved separately in several different plant lineages. So coffee, you guys all I'm sure know that coffee has caffeine in it. Tea is a separate lineage. And then cocoa also has caffeine in it, and that same compound has evolved separately in each of those different groups. So some herbivores have evolved the ability to digest or use the chemicals, something like a monarch butterfly, which eats milkweed and then actually integrates the toxins from milkweed into its body to protect itself from predators. So some consumers have evolved special abilities to do things like that, where they actually use the toxins from the plants that they eat and incorporate them into their own bodies. This brings up this question of why aren't all prey unpalatable? Why haven't all prey evolved this ability to be in some way toxic to possible predators? So essentially, chemical defenses are expensive and they require large investments of energy and nutrients to be able to be something that is toxic or unpalatable. So some noxious animals rely on their host plants for their noxious chemical defenses. So something like the monarch butterfly that we talked about, which eats milkweed and then incorporates that into its tissues. But not all food plants contain those chemicals, and animals that are utilizing those chemicals have to have their own ways to avoid the toxic effects. So they have to have special metabolism within their bodies that don't allow them to be affected by those toxins, but instead just be able to incorporate them into themselves and use those as a defense. So that type of metabolism and that type of adaptation can be very energetically expensive. So not all organisms are able to do this. So sometimes there are organisms that will pretend to be something that they aren't, to try to trick predators into not eating them. So this is something that we call Batesian mimicry. And this is where you have palatable species that mimic the appearance of unpalatable species. And so they benefit from predators learning that those unpalatable species should not be eaten. So the unpalatable species is called a model, and the one that pretends to be unpalatable or looks like that one that is unpalatable is called the mimic. And so the mimic will essentially evolve to look very similar to that model unpalatable species. And so predators will avoid them because it's not worth the potential cost of eating something that could end up hurting you. So in the pictures on the bottom of the screen, they all look really similar. One of them is dangerous and could hurt you, and the other two are completely benign, but they look like the dangerous one, and so predators would avoid all of them. So the individual in the middle is a moth, and the one to the right is a mantispid. And those are completely benign, would not hurt you. You could hold them in your hand and have no problem. The insect all the way to the left is a wasp, and it would be something you really don't want to hold in your hand. But they all look so similar that a predator from far away wouldn't really be able to tell the difference and would therefore just avoid all of them. And so experimental studies have demonstrated the benefits to the mimic. So predators quickly learn to recognize color patterns of unpalatable prey, and mimics are avoided by those predators. So if a predator learns that something is dangerous, it will just avoid it altogether. So looking like something that's dangerous is a lot less energetically expensive than actually becoming dangerous yourself. Another type of mimicry that's common in nature is called Mullerian mimicry. And this is where you have unpalatable species that come to resemble one another. So this is an example of convergent evolution, where a lot of species that look similar tend to have the same types of defenses. So in this case, you have a bunch of different types of butterflies with similar patterns and similar colors. And so predators for these butterflies would end up learning that they are toxic and dangerous, and you only have to learn this one color pattern instead of learning a bunch of them. So all of these butterflies have a red, black, white, yellow sort of color pattern, and if birds and other predators learn to just avoid that altogether, then they don't have to learn each and every one of these. They just avoid any butterfly that looks anything like this. So a lot of the time you can have a lot of different species that are involved, and each species is both a model and a mimic. And this process is efficient because learning by the predator with any model benefits all other members of the mimicry complex. And so certain aposematic colors and patterns may be widespread within a particular region. So these are all heliconius butterflies, and they all have that same pattern. So we've talked quite a bit about predators. So predators catch individuals and consume them, and they remove them from the prey population. Parasites consume parts of a living prey organism or a host, and they may be either internal or external. Parasitoids consume the living tissues of their host and eventually kill them. So we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about parasites and parasitoids. Parasites have adaptations to ensure their dispersal. So they are usually a lot smaller than their host, and they either live on the outside of their body or somewhere inside of their body. Internal parasites exist in a benign environment. So they have a nice warm place with food and stable conditions, and that's all provided by their host. External parasites have to deal with things like the host trying to remove them from their body. Parasites also have to deal with a number of other challenges. So the host organisms might have mechanisms to detect and destroy their parasites. So something like cleaning behaviors, like if you think of monkeys, like picking ticks and things off of each other. And parasites also have to disperse through hostile environments. And a lot of the time they have complicated life cycles with multiple hosts. So an example of that would be in malaria, which is caused by the Plasmodium parasite. So we've talked a little bit about malaria and Plasmodium already this semester. So just a little brief overview of this again. So they're adapted to do different hosts, so humans and mosquitoes, and they have adaptations to disperse between the hosts, including gene silencing that allows them to prevent detection when they're in either a human or a mosquito immune system. Another quick example are guinea worms, which are parasites that actually have adaptations to ensure their dispersal. So they're adapted to two different hosts, both humans and little organisms that are called cyclops. And they have an adaptation that allows them to disperse between hosts. So when they're in a person, they'll start causing itching on like the person's foot. And to alleviate that will cause the person to go and put their feet in water. The larvae will then disperse out of the human and move into the water, where they can then get into the cyclops, because those organisms live in the water. And so if there's a short video for you guys to watch to learn a little bit more about these when you have time. But these guys are really interesting, and hopefully we can eventually completely eradicate them. So parasitoids are incredibly interesting, and they're very important for keeping the numbers of different insects, their population numbers down. So there are a lot of different species of wasps and flies that develop inside the larvae or pupae of other insects. So they actually live inside their hosts, and eventually they lead to the death of the host. They will generally eat them from the inside out. Parasitoids tend to be host specific, meaning that they only use one species of host. So if in the picture in the bottom right of your screen, there's a caterpillar and it looks like it has eggs all over it. And it does, but those are parasitoid eggs. So it's a wasp that laid eggs inside that caterpillar, and those eggs will eventually hatch, and the wasp larvae will eat that caterpillar from the inside out and eventually kill it. So parasites will not intentionally kill their prey. Parasitoids will eventually kill their prey. A really fun example of a parasitoid is a phorid fly that infects a species of ant. So fire ants are native in South America, and they're attacked by decapitating flies. So the flies will lay eggs in the ant's head, and then the ant will wander back to the nest. Eventually, it will cause the ant's head to fall off, and the flies will emerge out of that ant's head. So it's just an interesting version of this. And if you guys are super interested in parasites and parasitoids, I would recommend reading the book Parasite Rex. It's really interesting and gives a lot of really good detail and examples on parasites and their different life cycles. So up to this point, we've talked a lot about predator and consumer types of interactions where one individual benefits and the other one is harmed. In the next set of slides, we're going to talk about competition, which is an interaction between members of a community where both of them are harmed. And this is because competition is the use or defense of a resource by one individual that reduces the availability of that resource to other individuals. So usually when you think about competition, you probably think about two lions competing for access to food, or a lion and a hyena competing for access to food. It's not always something where there's a direct competition. It can also be indirect. So it can be an indirect competition for food, where maybe you're a better forager or you're a better hunter, and so you're just able to get more food than someone else. It could be a competition for something like light. So trees actually and other plants actually compete for access to light. And so they'll spread their canopies out and they get taller to try to be taller and larger than the other trees to be able to access that light. Plants and animals both compete for water. So it can be a direct competition where you're fighting for access to water, or it can be something a little more indirect where plants will grow their roots out and grow even into the area of another plant and try to get the water in that area. Plants can also compete for nutrients. So nutrients are in the soil and they have to be able to take those up. So some of them may be more efficient at that. But they also are using their roots to be able to compete for nutrients. And animals will compete for shelter and space as well as breeding sites. And so you may be able to find those quicker, or you may be able to directly compete for those. But competitions, again, are not always direct head-to-head combat. Sometimes they're just the fact that there's individuals there, and using that resource takes away that resource from another individual. There are two distinct types of competition. So there's intra-specific competition and inter-specific competition. Intra-specific competition is where you have competition between individuals of a single species. So this would be something like two male flamingos fighting for access to females, or two male elephant seals fighting for access to a harem of females, something to that effect, or two male tigers fighting for access to a territory of land. So they're fighting over resources that affect survival. So this can be nutrients or habitat. So it would be fighting over a territory of land where there's good amounts of prey resources, or if you're a bird and you have a territory, fighting over the best territory that has the best access to whatever your food source is. And it can also be a competition where you are fighting over resources that affect reproduction, so mates, nest sites, and territories. Interspecific competition is competition between individuals of different species. So in this case, it would be something like lions and hyenas, where they're both competing for access to meat from prey animals, but lions are usually hunters and hyenas are scavengers. They're still competing for the food that the lions bring down, but they are they're going about it in different ways. So the lion will bring the food down, and then hyenas will try to overtake them by numbers and steal that food from the lions. And so interspecific competition can be resources that affect survival, so again, nutrients and habitat, and it can also be resources that affect reproduction, so nest sites and territories. It's not going to be access to mates, because in this case, you have two different species competing for something. Competition can be broken into two different categories. It can be either interference competition or exploitative competition. Interference competition occurs where you have an individual who stops someone else from obtaining that resource. So if you think about if you live with roommates or your family or whatever, and you get some ice cream that you love and you put it in the freezer. Interference competition would be where if someone goes to the freezer, you intercept them every time and talk to them and distract them and get them to move away from that resource, that ice cream. Exploitative competition would be that if your family member or your roommate goes to get some ice cream and you've already eaten all of it. So you've taken their opportunity to have that resource away from them. So interference competition is where something happens where an organism stops someone else from being able to access that resource. Exploitative competition is where you use a resource up and make it so that it's no longer available for someone else. Competition exists because resources are limited, and certain resources are more limited than others. And those resources we call limiting resources. So a resource is a substance or a factor that is consumed by an organism and that can lead to increased population growth rates as its availability in the environment is increased. So more of that resource will lead to more population growth, less of it will lead to less population growth. So an example of this would be in plants, which need phosphorus and nitrogen and all of those other minerals to be able to grow. If you add those nutrients to the soil, the plant will grow more. If you don't, it will not grow as much because those nutrients are generally limited in that environment. So they're considered limiting resources. They're limiting the amount of growth in those plants depending on their availability. So a resource is anything that an individual needs to survive and reproduce and that can be used up. So what are not considered resources? Those would be things like the conditions of the environment. And these can influence an organism's ability to consume resources, but they themselves are not used up by an individual. So this would be something like temperature. So if you think about things that we would call cold-blooded, like reptiles, so think about a crocodile or a snake, they need their body to be at a certain temperature to be able to function and to be able to go and attack prey and digest it. So they'll sit and get some sun and warm their body temperature up enough that they're able to move around. that temperature is vital for their survival and their ability to move and hunt. But an individual crocodile or snake is not going to use up the temperature in a place. So a temperature is not a resource. Similarly, humidity and salinity are important factors for plants, whether they're aquatic or terrestrial, as well as some aquatic animals. And so those conditions, those environmental conditions, are important for the survival of those organisms, but no organism is going to be able to use up those resources. So Liebig's law of the minimum states that the growth of an individual or a population will be limited by the least abundant limiting resource. So if you think about population size as water in a barrel, and the different slats on that barrel as different resources, the one that has the lowest amount is the one that is limiting the growth of that population. And to test which resource is limiting, you would essentially add these different limiting resources to that population and see which one causes it to grow. So whichever one is causing that population to be able to grow and get larger is the one that was limiting the population growth and is the most limiting factor for that population. Within competition, we have a principle that's called the principle of competitive exclusion. It's also called Gauss's law because that is the scientist who came up with this concept. So this principle states that two species that are so similar that they compete for the same limiting resource cannot coexist in the same place indefinitely. One of them either has to adapt or perish. So the initial experiments on this principle were done with paramecium. So we've talked a bit about paramecium this semester. So they're single-celled organisms, and they have a few different species. So these experiments were done with Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum. When each of those is in a medium alone, they are able to survive and reproduce, and their numbers are good. When you put them in the same container together, Paramecium aurelia will completely outcompete Paramecium caudatum and will eventually cause them to go extinct in that particular environment. So in that case, the Paramecium aurelia is more competitive for resources than Paramecium caudatum, and so it outcompetes it and makes it so that it's not able to live in the exact same environment at the same time. So competition can either cause two organisms to be unable to live in the same environment at the same time, and so one of them is unable to live in coexistence with the other, or you can have what we call character displacement, and this is where two species that are living sympatrically can evolve different adaptations to avoid competition. So a good example of this are Darwin's finches, which colonized the Galapagos Islands and started radiating from a single species outwards. And they did this by specializing on different types of food sources. So there's large and small nuts and berries and things like that. There's insects on those islands. And the idea is that within a species, there is genetic variation. So different members of the same species will have variation within them, and those different individuals will start eating different resources. If that resource is not competed for, then those individuals are going to be able to survive, reproduce, and pass their genes on. So if you have a large beak and you're able to eat large seeds, which most of the other individuals of your species are unable to do, then you're going to pass those large beaked genes on to the next population or the next generation. And over time, over millions of years, you can have the evolution of different types of birds, and they evolve into different species that specialize on different resources within that environment, which allows them to coexist. So before selection, you might have very similar overlap in a trait, but after selection, they diverge enough that they specialize on different types of food, so that those individuals are able to live in the same space at the same time. So competition can either cause the inferior competitor to go extinct in that area, or it can cause the individuals of those two different species to diverge enough that they're no longer in direct competition. But two individuals that are exactly the same cannot live in the same space indefinitely through time.